John Matthews boarded Southwest Flight 2867 like everyone else, but within an hour his violent outburst turned a routine trip into a nightmare that ended with zip ties, an arrest, and a lawsuit no one saw coming. The morning sun was rising over Phoenix when passengers filed onto Southwest Flight 2867, most of them expecting a simple, uneventful trip to Denver. Parents wrangled restless children. Business travelers settled in with laptops, and others leaned back, eager for a quiet nap in the skies. The flight attendants greeted each person with their usual smiles, the routine familiar and comforting. For many on board, it was just another short journey between two busy cities. But among the rows of passengers, one man stood out. He clutched his bag with unusual intensity, his eyes darting from row to row as though he were searching for something or someone. At first, no one paid him much attention. Strange behavior on flights wasn't unheard of, and most chalked it up to nerves. But within minutes, it became harder to ignore. As the plane taxied, the man's restlessness grew. He shifted constantly in his seat, tapping his foot in sharp, uneven rhythms. The attendants noticed but kept their distance, not wanting to cause a scene before takeoff. His muttering began quietly, almost inaudible, but soon the whispers turned into sharp bursts of words that made nearby passengers glance nervously in his direction. His agitation seemed to rise in waves, as if something unseen was pushing him toward a breaking point. Some travelers tried to distract themselves, putting in headphones or flipping through magazines, but others stared, waiting to see what he might do next. By the time the plane lifted off the runway, the tension around him was impossible to ignore. He unbuckled his seatbelt before the signal allowed it, pacing back and forth in the aisle, forcing attendants to repeatedly ask him to return to his seat. His movements grew more frantic each time, his hand clenching the overhead bins as though steadying himself against invisible pressure. For the first time, a ripple of unease swept through the cabin. The nervous laughter and whispered comments made it clear that this was no longer dismissed as harmless behavior. Families began pulling their children closer, while solo travelers tried to avoid his gaze. The crew exchanged subtle looks, their concern hidden behind professional expressions. Though no one said it aloud, the thought was clear: if this man's behavior escalated further, the safety of the entire flight could be in jeopardy. What started as a routine flight was already transforming into something unpredictable. The calm skies outside, a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside the cabin. Passengers braced themselves, unaware that what they had seen so far was only the beginning of a journey none of them would ever forget. As the aircraft settled into cruising altitude, the man's behavior shifted from unsettling to alarming. His pacing grew more forceful, his steps heavy against the carpeted aisle, making heads turn every time he passed. He stopped suddenly at random rows, staring down at strangers in a way that made them shrink back into their seats. Some passengers pressed the call button to alert the crew, but the attendants were already watching closely, trying to strike the delicate balance between de-escalation and maintaining calm. The energy in the cabin had shifted entirely. Where moments before there had been the quiet hum of conversation and the shuffle of snack service, now there was silence punctuated by uneasy glances and the man's increasingly erratic movements. When he began slamming his hands against the overhead compartments, the silence broke with gasps. A woman in the middle rows clutched her child's arm, pulling her closer as the sound of plastic panels rattled above. The attendants rushed forward, their voices firm but professional, instructing him to return to his seat. Instead of complying, he twisted away sharply and stomped toward the front of the cabin. His sudden lunge toward the cockpit door drew a collective cry of panic, the type of sound that comes when dozens of people realize at once they might be in danger. The situation was no longer one of inconvenience, it was one of possible catastrophe. Several passengers sprang from their seats, instinct overcoming hesitation. They blocked the aisle just as the man reached for the reinforced cockpit door, stopping him only inches away from pounding on it. His face twisted with fury as he shoved against them, his strength surprising for his size. The crew scrambled to assist, but it was clear they were not dealing with a simple disturbance. Every person watching understood that if he succeeded in breaching that door, the results could be unthinkable. The struggle created chaos throughout the plane. People shouted instructions, children cried, and others sat frozen, too terrified to move. A handful of passengers raised their phones, recording the scene as proof of what was unfolding high above the ground. The captain's voice came over the intercom with a brief reassurance that the flight was under control, but inside the cabin that was far from reality. The man's aggression had transformed the mood from mild anxiety to outright fear, and the fight to contain him was only just beginning. The attempt to stop the man quickly turned into a physical battle in the narrow aisle. His arms flailed wildly as passengers tried to restrain him, and every sharp movement made those nearby recoil in shock. He clawed at seatbacks, his nails scraping the fabric, and swung his fists at anyone who stepped closer. A flight attendant was shoved hard into an armrest, stumbling but refusing to back away. The man's voice rose in furious shouts, incoherent but filled with rage, echoing off the cabin walls like a warning siren. The situation was escalating faster than anyone could process, and panic swept through the rows as people realized the danger was not yet under control. A small group of passengers decided they couldn't wait for law enforcement on the ground. They surged forward, surrounding the man with a determination born of fear and survival. One grabbed his arm, another pinned his shoulder, while a third forced him down toward the carpeted floor. The struggle was violent and desperate, with the confined space amplifying every movement. Seats rattled, drinks spilled, and startled screams filled the air as the scuffle unfolded only inches from where people sat helplessly watching. Though the group managed to push him down, he refused to surrender. His legs kicked wildly, slamming into the aisle walls, nearly knocking down another attendant who was trying to assist. The crew quickly realized ordinary measures wouldn't be enough. From the back of the plane, one attendant retrieved plastic zip ties designed for emergencies. Passengers held the man down as the crew looped the restraints around his wrists. The sound of the ties ratcheting tight cut through the chaos, but even that did not stop his resistance. He twisted and thrashed on the floor, his face red with exertion, his muffled shouts continuing as though fueled by something unstoppable. The restraint seemed more like a temporary pause than a resolution. The cabin was left in a tense silence, broken only by his growls and the heavy breathing of those who had helped subdue him. Passengers returned shakily to their seats, but no one relaxed. Eyes remained fixed on the restrained figure, his body still jerking against the plastic bonds. The flight continued through calm skies, yet inside the cabin it felt like a storm was raging, with everyone wondering if the restraints would hold until they landed. The fear that he could break free kept hearts pounding, turning every passing minute into a test of patience and nerves. When the plane finally touched down in Denver, the sense of relief was almost overwhelming, but it was fragile and short-lived. Passengers remained seated, their eyes glued to the restrained man in the aisle as the aircraft taxied toward the gate. His wrists were bound tightly with the zip ties, yet he continued to thrash, mumbling angrily under his breath, glaring at those who had helped subdue him. The cabin, usually filled with the rustle of bags and the chatter of people eager to disembark, was eerily quiet. Everyone was waiting, tense and exhausted, for law enforcement to board and take him away. The door opened, and uniformed officers rushed in. Their presence brought a wave of relief, but it also reignited the intensity of the moment. They moved swiftly, lifting the restrained man from the floor and escorting him down the aisle. He resisted even then, dragging his feet, his body jerking against their hold as he was removed from the aircraft. Some passengers clapped in relief, while others simply leaned back in their seats, drained by the ordeal. The nightmare in the skies seemed to be over, yet the unease lingered like a shadow. The image of him fighting against both passengers and crew was etched into everyone's memory, impossible to forget. Outside the aircraft, police cars waited on the tarmac. The man was placed into custody, and passengers expected the story to end with a simple arrest. But within hours, the incident began to take a new and unexpected turn. News outlets picked up the story, describing the dramatic restraint and the chaos inside the cabin. What seemed like a clear account of a dangerous passenger was quickly complicated by reports that he had suffered injuries during the struggle. His family claimed he had been beaten and mistreated, raising accusations that the airline and its passengers had gone too far. As coverage spread, so did the debate. Was the crew justified in their actions, or had they crossed a line in subduing him? Some praised the passengers for their bravery, insisting they had likely prevented a disaster. Others questioned whether panic had driven them to use unnecessary force. The airline released a statement commending the professionalism of the crew, but public opinion remained divided. The simple narrative of a mid-air disturbance was unraveling. replaced with a storm of legal questions, public scrutiny, and the unsettling realization that the incident was far from over. The weeks that followed the chaotic flight brought a flood of headlines, interviews, and speculation. What began as a frightening mid-air disturbance was transforming into a high-stakes legal battle. The restrained passenger, now identified as a man with a troubled history, filed a lawsuit against Southwest Airlines and hinted at action against certain passengers who had helped subdue him. He claimed he had been assaulted, his wrists injured by the zip ties, and that he had been denied proper medical care after landing. His legal team framed the incident as a case of negligence and abuse, turning what many saw as a heroic intervention into a narrative of victimization. Court documents revealed surprising details that reignited the public's interest. The man had been flagged for erratic behavior at the airport prior to boarding, yet he was allowed on the plane without further evaluation. His attorneys argued this failure placed not only him but also everyone else in danger. On the other side, the airline insisted the crew had acted correctly, highlighting how quickly the situation had escalated and how their response likely prevented something catastrophic. Meanwhile, passengers who had bravely stepped in to help were caught in the middle, some hailed as heroes by the public, while others were subpoenaed as witnesses in a case that seemed to grow more complicated each day. As the trial date approached, media outlets dissected every detail, replaying shaky cell phone footage of the struggle inside the cabin. Experts debated whether zip ties were too extreme, or if the situation justified any measure necessary to protect lives on board. Families of passengers came forward with statements describing the terror they had felt, lending credibility to the idea that drastic action had been required. Yet the opposing side continued to paint a picture of brutality and overreaction. Public opinion shifted back and forth, divided between those who sympathized with the restrained man and those who saw him as the sole cause of the chaos. When the trial finally began, the courtroom was packed, and the atmosphere was as tense as the flight itself. Testimonies clashed, evidence was scrutinized, and the world watched closely. No matter the outcome, the case had already left a lasting impact. The flight that should have been routine became a symbol of how quickly safety can unravel in the skies and how truth becomes blurred once legal battles begin. What lingered was not only the memory of fear at 30,000 feet, but also the haunting reminder that the story of that day would follow everyone involved for years to come.